We are taught in school how the First World War began. 2 bullets, an archduke killed in Sarajevo, and a chain of events that no one supposedly wanted. We are told it was a series of unfortunate accidents, that alliances misfired and dragged the world into war by mistake, as if millions of men were pushed into the trenches unwillingly by forces no one controlled. But this is the version of history written for children. It ignores the true motivations of empires. It overlooks the cold, calculated, and ruthless realities of economics. And if we want to understand why millions of soldiers died in the trenches, and why the Middle East is shaped the way it is today, we have to look beyond those 2 bullets. To understand the First World War, we have to look beyond the assassination. The real answer is not found in weapons or ideologies, but in maps and trade routes. Picture a world map from the year 1900 and try to identify the one thing that frightened the British Empire more than any army or navy. It was not a weapon. It was not a fleet. It was a railway line, a line that promised to connect the heart of Europe to the depths of the Middle East, a land route that could bypass Britain's control of the seas and open the door to a new global order. This is the story of the railway planned to run from Berlin to Baghdad. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire stood as the undisputed ruler of the world. This power rested on 2 foundations. The first was the Royal Navy, which controlled every major sea lane of global trade. The second was the Suez Canal, the very heart of the empire. For Britain, Suez was more than a waterway. It was the shortest route to India, and India was the core of the British system. As long as the Suez Canal remained under British control, Britain decided who could trade with the East, when they could trade, and on what terms. For an empire that ruled the seas, the real threat did not come from the ocean. The real threat was an alternative that could bypass it. At the same time, a new power was rising in the heart of Europe. Germany had unified in 1871, and in a remarkably short time, it had become an industrial giant. German factories were beginning to outperform Britain, and German engineering was setting the pace for the world. But Germany faced a critical problem. It had no empire, it possessed no vast colonies, and it lacked direct access to cheap raw materials. More importantly, Germany did not have a navy capable of challenging Britain. Germany was powerful, but it was trapped at the center of Europe. Global trade moved across the seas, and the seas were controlled by Britain. And so, Germany faced a dilemma. There was a path through which it could project its power, but that path did not run through the ocean. While Germany was rising, another empire was collapsing to the southeast. The Ottoman Empire had been a superpower for centuries, but by the end of the 19th century, it was known in Europe as the sick man. Territories had been lost. The army was outdated. But the greatest problem did not come from war. It came from debt. The Ottoman state was drowning in loans owed to British and French banks. In 1881, the empire officially went bankrupt. In exchange for its debts, the Ottomans lost control over their own economy. Taxes and revenues, from salt to tobacco, were collected by foreign creditors. Money that should have filled the state treasury was flowing instead into vaults in London and Paris. Under these conditions, the Ottoman leadership faced a single question. Was there a way out of this collapse? While Germany was searching for a way out, the Ottoman Empire was searching for a way to survive. Their problems were different, but their needs brought them to the same point. Germany needed a land route that would allow it to trade without remaining dependent on the seas. The Ottomans, on the other hand, wanted to regain control over their own territory, move their armies more quickly, and modernize without becoming even more dependent on foreign finance. Under these conditions, a single idea began to take shape: a railway line that would start in the heart of Europe, cross Anatolia, and reach deep into the Middle East. For Germany, this line offered a way to break the naval lock. For the Ottomans, it represented a chance for economic and military independence. This was the foundation on which the idea of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway was born. And this idea would go on to reshape not just 2 empires, but the balance of the world itself. When the idea of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway first emerged, it was never just a transportation project. For Germany, it was an attempt to secure a place within the global system. For the Ottoman Empire, it represented a hope, a way to escape economic dependency and restore state authority. The financial backing for the project came from Germany. The institution that assumed this role was one of the most powerful financial entities of the era, Deutsche Bank. With German capital, German engineering, and German technical expertise, a massive strategic undertaking was set in motion. The railway was planned to begin in Berlin, cross Vienna and the Balkans, reach Istanbul, and from there advance deep into Anatolia. This route was no coincidence. The line was deliberately designed to follow the very backbone of Ottoman territory. Once construction began, the challenges proved enormous. Engineers were forced to carve tunnels through the rugged Taurus mountains. Rails had to be laid across deserts ruled by extreme heat. Mountains had to be pierced. Valleys had to be crossed. Thousands of kilometers of track were laid by human labor. For its time, this was a project that could only be described as an engineering marvel. As the railway pushed eastward, the balance of power in Europe began to shift, slowly but unmistakably. The Berlin-Baghdad line was no longer an idea. It was becoming a tangible reality. And this reality triggered a wave of panic in London. British strategic planners repeatedly returned to their maps, calculating what this line truly meant. The conclusion was unavoidable. If this railway were completed, German goods could move freely into the Middle East and onward to the Indian Ocean without ever encountering the British Navy. The line would create a vast overland trade route completely beyond the reach of the Royal Navy. But trade was never Britain's deepest fear. The real threat was oil. What truly frightened Britain was not the railway as an object, not the steel, not the stations, not the tracks. The real fear was where it could lead, what it could connect, and what it could bypass. Because at the start of the 20th century, the world was entering a quiet revolution, a revolution that most people did not notice at first. For generations, imperial power had been built on coal. Coal drove the factories, coal powered the railways, coal moved the fleets that ruled the oceans. But coal had limits. It was heavy, it took time to load, and it restricted how far a navy could operate without stopping. Oil changed that equation. It burned hotter and cleaner. It delivered more power for its weight. And it allowed ships to travel faster, stay at sea longer, and strike farther from home. Britain understood this before anyone else. The leaders of the Royal Navy were blunt about it. If the fleet wanted to survive in the new century, it would have to convert to oil. But that decision created a dangerous weakness. Britain did not have enough oil on its own island. The future of the Royal Navy, and by extension the future of the empire, would depend on supplies coming from far away, from lands beyond the British Isles, from regions Britain needed to keep within reach. And this is where the Berlin-Baghdad Railway becomes something else entirely. The land it was meant to cross, Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, was beginning to be understood as an ocean of oil. And the Germans were not only laying track, they had secured rights along the railway corridor, the ability to search, claim, and profit from resources beside it. So this was never only about moving goods. It was about controlling the fuel that would power the next era of warfare. If the railway reached the sea, Germany could gain access to the Middle East on land, and with it, gain leverage over oil, the one resource the British Navy would soon need to survive. That was unacceptable for Britain, because it meant the empire's lifeline could be placed in another power's hands. That is why, in Britain's eyes, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway was not just a transport route. It was an existential threat. The British Empire now clearly saw the threat posed by the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. This line could not be allowed to reach completion, but Britain faced a dilemma. The railway ran through Ottoman territory. A direct military intervention could trigger a major war far too early. For this reason, the first move was not made with weapons, but through diplomacy. Britain turned its attention to a small but critical territory at the end of the railway's path, Kuwait. British representatives signed a secret agreement with the Sheikh of Kuwait. Under its terms, Kuwait would not lease any land to foreign powers without British approval. With this move, the railway's access to the sea was effectively cut off. The Berlin-Baghdad line still existed on maps, but it could no longer reach its intended destination. Britain did not stop there. This time, propaganda was brought into play. British newspapers began portraying the Ottoman Empire as backward and oppressive. Germany was depicted as a dangerous power, supporting brute force and cooperating with authoritarian regimes. The railway was no longer described as a development project, but as a tool of domination and exploitation. The final move came from Britain's strongest weapon, finance. London's financial circles worked to ensure that not a single pound would flow into the railway project. British capital withdrew entirely. The objective was clear: to starve the railway of money. But the Germans did not retreat. Construction continued despite all pressure. By 1914, the tracks had reached southern Anatolia, up to the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. The railway was not finished, but it had advanced too far to be ignored. The threat was real. At this point, tensions in Europe reached a breaking point. Rivalry between the great powers could no longer be controlled through diplomacy alone. The First World War erupted in this atmosphere, and when the war began, Britain did not look to Berlin first. Maps were opened once again. Eyes turned toward the Middle East, because the issue was no longer just the battlefields. It was the railway itself. And this line had become a target that would shape the course of the war. While the First World War was still ongoing, long before a victor had emerged, Britain and France had already begun discussing the future of Ottoman lands among themselves. In 1916, two diplomats sat down at a table, Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot. A map lay before them. Pens were in their hands. This map did not take into account peoples, tribes, or religious communities. It showed only interests. The lines that were drawn were no accident. These borders aligned almost perfectly with the planned route of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway and the known oil fields. Britain took control of southern Iraq and the port of Haifa. France asserted authority over Syria and Lebanon. At the same time, promises were also made to the Arabs. In return for revolting against the Ottomans, independence was pledged. The symbolic figure of these uprisings was Thomas Edward Lawrence. The railway was targeted, tracks were sabotaged, bridges were blown apart. The Ottoman army struggled to survive with German assistance, but the railway was unfinished. Supplies were unloaded, carried across mountains by horses, and loaded back onto trains. This logistical bottleneck slowly suffocated the Ottoman war effort. When the war ended, the Ottoman Empire was erased from the map. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was never completed, but its impact never truly ended, because sometimes the failure of a train to arrive can change the fate of an entire region forever. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was never completed. At a certain point, the tracks simply stopped. Maps changed. Empires collapsed. But the story did not end there, because the idea represented by the railway never disappeared. The idea of connecting Europe and the Middle East, East and West, through land routes always returned. Throughout the 20th century, the same corridors were shaken by the same crises. Oil pipelines, military bases, trade routes all converged in the same geography. Sometimes history is not written by winners and losers, but by those who never arrived. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway never reached its destination, but its failure to arrive reshaped the fate of an entire region forever.